Summer 1944. The war in Europe is still raging, but across the Atlantic, deep in the heart of Texas, a convoy of olive green U.S. Army trucks rumbles through a dust-blown road. Inside, behind slatted wooden benches, sit rows of captured German soldiers, sunburned, silent, and hollow-eyed. Their uniforms are torn, their pride half buried in the heat. They had been told to expect cruelty, beatings, hunger, hatred. Instead, when the trucks grind to a halt, they stare in disbelief. Before them stretches a camp that looks nothing like a prison. Neatly aligned barracks, a baseball diamond carved into the dirt. American guards waving casually, smoking, joking. Beyond the fence, a banner flutters above a canteen window. Cold drinks, Coca-Cola, 5C. A corporal orders them off the truck. The Germans shuffle forward, clutching duffel bags. One soldier, barely 20, pauses as an American guard hands him a paper cup filled with something white and soft. Ice cream. Sweet, cold, impossible. He hesitates and tastes it. For the first time since Normandy, he feels something he cannot name. Not surrender, not fear, just confusion and a strange, quiet wonder. Because this is not the America he was told to hate. This is where the story begins. By the summer of 1944, the war in Europe had reached its breaking point. The Allied invasion of Normandy had torn open Hitler's fortress Europe, and German lines were collapsing under relentless pressure. Across France, Belgium, and Italy, the Allies were capturing tens of thousands of German soldiers every week. Too many for Europe's improvised holding sites to contain. In Washington, the War Department faced a practical and moral question. What to do with nearly 500,000 enemy soldiers? The answer, astonishing in its simplicity, was to bring them to America. Between 1942 and 1945, more than 425,000 German prisoners of war were shipped across the Atlantic. They were scattered among over 600 camps, stretching from California's deserts to Maine's forests. Most were placed in the rural heart of America, Texas, Georgia, Kansas, Iowa, far from coasts and cities, far from escape routes. For many of these men, the journey itself was a humiliation wrapped in disbelief. They had been the soldiers of Hitler's once proud Wehrmacht, told they were fighting for the most advanced nation on earth. Now they stood on the decks of Liberty ships escorted by American sailors, staring at a horizon lined not with ruins but with factories, farmland, and order. When they arrived in the United States, they were stunned again. The war that had shattered Europe had barely touched American soil. There were no bombed cities here, no hunger, no fear in the streets. The trains that carried them inland past green fields, laughing children and small towns with white church steeples. For men raised in the iron discipline of the Third Reich, it was like crossing into another world. At first, many Americans were uneasy about the idea. Newspapers carried editorials asking why enemy soldiers should be brought into the country instead of being locked up overseas. Families who had lost sons in Europe bristled at the thought of German prisoners eating American food or sleeping in American beds. Yet the U.S. government insisted it was both a strategic necessity and a moral obligation. Under the 1929 Geneva Convention, every prisoner of war was to be treated humanely, with shelter, food, and medical care, equivalent to that of the detaining power's own troops. America intended not just to follow those rules, but to exceed them. It was a statement to the world, and to Germany itself, that democracy could win a war without losing its soul. Camps were built quickly, but not crudely. Rows of wooden barracks, mess halls, infirmaries, and recreation fields. Watchtowers and fences, yes, but also classrooms, libraries, and work programs. The goal was to keep the men busy, fed, and ideally reformed. By autumn 1944, these camps had become miniature societies. Inside them lived the spectrum of the German army. Battle-hardened veterans, teenage recruits, submariners, Luftwaffe pilots, and captured officers. Some were unrepentant Nazis. Others were farmers and teachers drafted into a war they no longer believed in. The first shock for many came not from the barbed wire, but from the behavior of their guards. American soldiers greeted them with professionalism, even indifference. There were no beatings, no humiliation. Some guards even chatted casually with prisoners about baseball, cars, or family life. The Germans, accustomed to propaganda that portrayed Americans as greedy, violent, and racially degenerate, were bewildered. Food was another revelation. While Europe starved, American camps served full meals: meat, bread, vegetables, coffee, even dessert. The portions were so generous that some prisoners tried to smuggle leftovers to their comrades, thinking it a trap. Slowly, the disbelief began to fade. They realized the camp wasn't designed to break them, but to contain them, and perhaps in subtle ways, to show them a different kind of world. A world where a soldier could eat well, rest, read, and even play music while the war that had consumed his homeland continued far away. It was in that paradox, captured yet comfortable, defeated yet respected, that the psychological transformation of thousands of German POWs began. Because what started as a logistical solution soon became something far deeper. A living confrontation between two civilizations, one built on fear, the other on freedom. And as more prisoners arrived, the question grew sharper. How would the ideals of the Geneva Convention hold under the weight of a global war? The United States entered the war with a clear legal and moral guideline: the 1929 Geneva Convention, relative to the treatment of prisoners of war. Signed by most major powers, it required humane treatment, fair labor conditions, and protection from violence or intimidation. But it was one thing to sign a treaty, and another to live by it during the largest war in human history. For the U.S. Army, compliance was not just about morality, it was about image. The War Department knew that thousands of American prisoners were now in German hands. If the United States mistreated its captives, Germany could retaliate against American POWs in Europe. So the logic was both moral and pragmatic: treat them well to protect our own. When the first German POWs stepped off ships in New York, Virginia, and Louisiana, they were processed by the Army Service Forces, fingerprinted, photographed, deloused, and issued uniforms stenciled PW. From there, they were dispersed to hundreds of base camps and smaller branch camps spread across nearly every state. The camps themselves were built with remarkable efficiency. Each had barracks, a mess hall, a canteen, an infirmary, and fenced exercise yards. American officers commanded the sites, but inside the wire, the Germans largely ran their own affairs: cooks, clerks, even barbers. Hierarchies were preserved. Senior NCOs maintained order and discipline. Work was mandatory but regulated by the convention. Prisoners could not be forced to labor directly for the war effort, but they could work in agriculture, forestry, and public services. As American men went overseas, these POWs quietly filled the labor gap at home, harvesting crops, building roads, cutting timber. Farmers who once cursed Hitler now relied on his captured soldiers to bring in their wheat. For the men behind the wire, life fell into a rhythm that felt both surreal and strangely stable. Every morning began with roll call. The rest of the day was divided between work, meals, and recreation. There were lectures, musical performances, soccer matches. Protestant and Catholic chaplains held services. Some camps even printed their own German-language newsletters, but perhaps the most striking aspect was freedom of thought. Inside those American fences, German soldiers could discuss politics, question Nazi ideology, and read foreign newspapers, things that would have been impossible under the Third Reich. In some camps, the U.S. military even established re-education programs, offering classes on democracy, world history, and literature. Not all accepted it. Among the prisoners were die-hard Nazis who viewed any cooperation as betrayal. They organized secret cells, enforced ideological discipline, and even carried out assassinations against fellow Germans who dared to express anti-Hitler views. These internal conflicts forced the U.S. Army to separate hardliners from moderates, transferring the most dangerous men to high-security camps in places like Alcatraz, Fort Devens, or remote desert sites in Arizona and New Mexico. Yet despite these tensions, the majority of POWs adapted quickly. The warmth of American treatment, though, and the sheer abundance of the country began to reshape their perceptions. Many were amazed not just by the food, but by what that food symbolized. In Germany, even civilians struggled for bread, and sugar was a luxury. Here the guards drank Coca-Cola, served hot dogs, and passed around cigarettes like water. On weekends they played baseball and listened to jazz on camp radios. For men raised under totalitarian regimentation, such casual freedom seemed almost unthinkable. This cultural contrast ran deeper than comfort. It struck at the heart of Nazi propaganda. They had been told America was weak, a land of chaos and moral decay dominated by Jews and corrupted by racial mixing. But what they saw was order, generosity, and wealth beyond imagination. Some POWs quietly wrote letters home, censored but still telling, describing how well they were treated. "We have meat every day," one wrote. "They give us ice cream and cigarettes. The guards are polite. If this is America, then everything we were told was a lie." For the U.S. government, those letters were worth more than any leaflet or broadcast. They became living propaganda, not for a political ideology, but for a way of life. By the end of 1944, camps across the country had evolved into strange, stable worlds of their own. The fences remained, but the fear within them had faded. German soldiers worked American soil, read American newspapers, and dreamed, and perhaps guiltily, of a world after the war where such comfort might exist in their own homeland. The irony was profound. The same nation that was bombing Germany by night was giving its captured soldiers a taste of freedom by day. And as the front lines in Europe closed in on Hitler's crumbling empire, the prisoners inside those American fences began to face a quieter, more personal battle, not for survival but for understanding, because the more they saw of America, the less they understood the world they had left behind. The human angle, disbelief behind barbed wire. For most German soldiers, captivity in America began in silence. The first days inside the camps were filled with watchfulness, eyes scanning the guards, the fences, the faces. They expected punishment, perhaps vengeance. Yet what came instead was routine, respect, and order. Many had fought fiercely in places like Normandy, Tunisia, and the Ardennes. They had seen comrades killed, cities destroyed, and propaganda that promised them the barbaric cruelty of the Anglo-Americans. The contrast now unfolding before their eyes. Well-fed guards, clean barracks, polite discipline was almost impossible to reconcile. Letters and diaries from the time show a common pattern. Shock giving way to confusion, then to reluctant admiration. One prisoner at Camp Swift, Texas, wrote, "I did not think it possible that a country at war could be so calm. Everything works. People laugh. There is no hatred here, only efficiency and plenty." That word, plenty, appears again and again. Food, clothing, cigarettes, soap. Even small luxuries like chewing gum or canned fruit left deep impressions. For men raised under rationing, it was as though America existed outside the war altogether. Psychologists later described this as moral disorientation. The prisoners were not only adjusting to defeat, they were confronting an entirely different vision of civilization. Their captors were powerful but casual, victorious but merciful. It was, in many ways, America's most effective weapon, not the atomic bomb or the B-17, but the quiet power of decency. Over time, humanity became contagious. German NCOs who had enforced rigid discipline found themselves softening. Some volunteered for work details, eager to escape boredom. Others took up painting, music, or English lessons. Even simple gestures, a guard sharing coffee, a farmer thanking a POW for helping in the fields, began to erode the wall of hatred built by years of war propaganda. Still, guilt lingered. Many prisoners wrestled with shame, not just for their defeat but for feeling gratitude toward an enemy. They did not know how to reconcile the two truths, that America was bombing their homeland while feeding them ice cream. The cultural angle, Coca-Cola, jazz, and the idea of freedom if. The human shock was emotional, the cultural one was sensory. For the first time, German soldiers came face to face with American popular culture, and it was unlike anything they had imagined. Camps often had recreation halls where guards played swing records or screened Hollywood films. POWs watched Clark Gable, Gene Autry, or newsreels showing New York City's glittering skyline. The tempo of jazz, free, improvisational, joyous, baffled men raised on military marches. Yet slowly, many grew to love it. Food played a starring role in this cultural awakening. POWs were often served dishes they had never seen: peanut butter, corn on the cob, pancakes with syrup. But it was the ice cream and Coca-Cola that became the most enduring symbols of their captivity. To American guards, those items were ordinary, simple comforts of home. To the Germans, they were surreal luxuries, They joked among themselves that only millionaires could afford such things in Europe. When Coca-Cola bottles appeared in the camp canteens, men would stare at the fizzing liquid as if it were a chemical experiment. One prisoner later recalled in an interview, "The first sip was like tasting freedom. Cold, sweet, unnecessary, yet it existed simply because someone wanted it to." That detail, the unnecessary sweetness, said more about the cultural divide than any political lecture could. In Nazi Germany, everything was rationed, justified, weaponized for the state. In America, even pleasure seemed industrialized. The Germans noticed other things too. They saw racial segregation in the South. Black American guards assigned to oversee German prisoners who had been raised believing themselves part of a master race. For many, this was the deepest shock of all. Some treated these guards with arrogance. Others, after weeks of contact, began questioning everything they had been taught. The irony was not lost on them. In Germany, millions had been enslaved and murdered in the name of racial purity. In America, the nation fighting against that ideology still struggled with its own contradictions. Yet even within that tension, the POWs saw a country that allowed protest, debate, and visible change, a concept alien to the world they had served. For a growing number, the fences of the POW camp began to feel less like captivity and more like a window. Through that window, they glimpsed a version of life where fear did not rule every decision, where laughter was not suspicious, where even the enemy seemed human. By late 1944, that realization had quietly transformed thousands of German soldiers. They were no longer the same men who had marched under Hitler's banners. They were witnesses to a culture that had conquered not through cruelty, but through its astonishing normalcy. And as the months passed, the cultural shock deepened into something far more profound, a moral awakening that would soon collide with the collapse of the Reich itself. Because while America offered Coca-Cola and calmness, Germany was burning. The psychological angle conflicted minds behind the wire. By late 1944, the initial shock of captivity had worn off for many German prisoners, but it left behind a profound internal struggle. Men who had once believed in the invincibility of the Reich and the moral superiority of the Nazi regime now found themselves living among Americans who treated them with dignity. Letters and diaries from the camps reveal a recurring tension: loyalty to their homeland versus admiration, even envy, for the society that held them prisoner. One officer wrote, "I fought for Germany, yet I see here a world I would never have imagined. How can I hate those who feed me and give me freedom?" The quiet rhythm of camp life forced them to confront what had been impossible on the battlefield. Reflection. Soldiers who had killed, marched, and obeyed orders without question now had hours to read, talk, and observe. Some began learning English or studying democracy, not out of coercion but out of curiosity. For many, this was disorienting. The doctrines drilled into them, about racial purity, obedience, and the corruption of the West, were exposed as propaganda. Psychologists later described the camps as unintentional therapy. Controlled confinement allowed prisoners to reevaluate beliefs while removing immediate threats to survival. Yet not all adapted. Die-hard loyalists resisted. Secret meetings reinforced Nazi ideology, creating tension with moderate prisoners. Fights occasionally erupted. In some camps, American guards had to intervene to prevent ideological enforcement from turning violent. This psychological friction foreshadowed a larger truth. Defeat was not only external, it was internal. POWs confronted the collapse of their worldviews before the physical end of the war arrived. The moral angle, confronting humanity in an enemy nation. For American authorities, the treatment of German prisoners was never just legal, it was moral theater. Camps became places where the question was quietly asked every day: how should we treat our enemy? In practice, this meant abundant food, medical care, and even recreational programs. Prisoners could practice religion, write letters, and work without coercion. Some were allowed to farm alongside American laborers. Others volunteered for educational programs, learning about democracy, engineering, and American culture. The moral stakes were high. Americans knew that harsh treatment could provoke reprisals against U.S. POWs in Europe. But many soldiers also believed in the intrinsic value of humane conduct. As one camp commander noted, It is easy to be cruel. It is hard and necessary to be good. This moral approach produced subtle victories. Many prisoners returned to Germany with stories of decency, ice cream, and baseball. They carried a quiet message that morality could survive even amid total war. The ethical contrast between American compassion and Nazi brutality created cognitive dissonance among the prisoners. They saw kindness not as weakness but as power, and for some this realization would later shape post-war decisions, rejecting Nazism, emigrating to the United States, or advocating for democratic ideals in reconstructed Germany. The social angle. Communities behind the wire camps did not exist in isolation. Many were placed in small towns, farms, or rural areas, and the interaction between German prisoners and local Americans created a complex social ecosystem. Farmers depended on POW labor for harvests. Townspeople bought items from POW-run canteens. Some Americans organized baseball games or dances, where the cultural gap was at its starkest. German soldiers wearing striped uniforms, playing alongside young American men in khakis, both groups sharing laughter over music and sport. These interactions were rarely simple. Suspicion lingered. Some locals worried about espionage or sabotage. Children were taught caution, yet many quickly grew fascinated with the prisoners' accents, stories, and manners. Letters and newspaper reports from the period show a mix of amazement and apprehension. One Texan farmer wrote, "They are polite, work hard, and even joke. But I never forget they were once our enemy." Over time, relationships grew more nuanced. POWs learned English idioms, adopted some local customs, and sometimes formed lasting friendships. Meanwhile, Americans gained a human face for the war, the men behind the enemy uniform. This social bridge planted seeds for post-war reconciliation and immigration. It was here, in the day-to-day, that the real influence of the POW camps emerged. They were laboratories of cultural and moral exchange. Unintended, quiet but powerful, the human, cultural, psychological, moral, and social angles together reveal a paradox. Men who had been trained to hate were confronted by the normalcy, generosity, and humanity of those they had been taught to destroy. And as the war in Europe reached its final months, the tension between these lived experiences and the collapse of Germany's front lines would bring them to an unforgettable turning point. Late 1944. Winter was creeping across Europe, and the once mighty Wehrmacht was in retreat. The Allies had liberated Paris, crushed German lines in Normandy, and pushed deep into Belgium. Every day brought reports of lost cities, destroyed factories, and surrendering units. Across the Atlantic, thousands of German POWs in the United States followed the news with a mix of disbelief, hope, and dread. For men in the camps, the war had shifted from immediate danger to moral and psychological uncertainty. They were no longer fighting for victory. They were witnessing its inevitable absence. The soldiers who had once marched confidently in parade formations now huddled in mess halls, reading censored news bulletins, trying to reconcile the collapse of the Reich with the comfort of camp life. In some camps, tensions flared. Die-hard Nazi loyalists refused to accept defeat, enforcing strict discipline among fellow prisoners. They punished those who showed too much admiration for American treatment, circulating secret leaflets condemning traitors and attempting to maintain ideological purity. Fights broke out, sometimes spilling into work details. American guards, usually indifferent, were forced to intervene to prevent serious violence. Yet for most, the turning point came not from conflict within the camps but from news from home. Reports of Allied advances into Germany, the destruction of Dresden, the encirclement of the Ruhr, and the relentless push into Berlin made abstract defeat tangible. Letters from family members, often fearful, sometimes starving, added to the psychological weight. Many POWs began to grasp a sobering reality. Their homeland was gone. Their families were in ruins, cities leveled, industries obliterated, and the ideology they had been raised to serve crumbling. The human cost of war was no longer something they observed from a distance. It was personal, immediate, and irreversible. For the younger prisoners, the contrast between America and Germany became almost unbearable. Here they were fed, clothed, and even entertained. Across the ocean, neighbors starved, streets were rubble, and fear ruled daily life. One soldier wrote in a diary entry from Camp Hearn, Texas, "We are prisoners of the world, yet prisoners of ourselves as well. America is alive, orderly, and calm. Germany is dying, burning, and cold. How can we belong to a nation that destroys its own children?" As the months passed, camp life subtly transformed. The Americans, for their part, adjusted to the psychological shifts among prisoners. Recreational activities increased. Baseball leagues became more formal. Music programs expanded. Officers encouraged educational classes, from carpentry to political science. It was as though the camps themselves had to evolve to meet the prisoners' growing awareness of defeat. The ice cream and Coca-Cola that had once elicited mere astonishment now carried symbolic weight. They were not just luxuries. They were reminders of a world that continued to function without violence, of a society that valued life even amid global conflict. For many, the taste of sweetness became bittersweet, pleasure intertwined with guilt and grief. By early 1945, the European war reached its final crescendo. The Allies crossed the Rhine, Hitler retreated to his bunker, and German cities fell in rapid succession. POWs followed the events obsessively. Radio broadcasts, censored but clear enough to convey major developments, filled the camp air with tension. Guards noted the change in mood, silent stares, quiet conversations, and the sudden disappearance of previously vociferous Nazi loyalists. In one striking incident at Camp Shelby, Mississippi, a group of young German soldiers staged a silent protest. They refused to participate in a morning roll call, not out of rebellion, but from despair. Officers moved cautiously, recognizing that these were men grappling with the collapse of everything they had known. The protest ended peacefully, but it reflected the internal disintegration occurring alongside Germany's physical defeat. For the prisoners, the paradox of their situation was profound. They were captives, yet safer, fed, and clothed than civilians in Germany. They were enemies, yet treated with respect and at times generosity. And as their homeland disintegrated under Allied assault, they were forced to confront what their leaders had promised versus the reality before their eyes. The moral and psychological tension reached its peak as VE Day approached in May 1945. Camp life, once structured and predictable, became a waiting game. Prisoners listened to BBC broadcasts, discussed rumors of Hitler's death, and debated the future of Germany. Many expressed relief, yet that relief was tinged with fear, shame, and uncertainty. Their defeat was absolute, not just militarily but culturally and morally. Some prisoners, particularly teenagers conscripted in the last years of the war, experienced a peculiar liberation. They had been sent to fight for an ideology they barely understood, and now they were alive, fed and unharmed. For them, the camps had become a sanctuary, a buffer from the annihilation engulfing Europe. But even this tentative comfort was fragile. Die-hard Nazis still whispered in corners, while rumors of retribution from ultra-loyalist factions in Germany spread anxiety. The prisoners' world was suspended between two realities: the ongoing destruction of their homeland and the stable, humane life inside the American fence. It was in these months, as the Reich's final defenses crumbled and news of Hitler's suicide spread, that the true turning point of the POW experience crystallized. The soldiers were no longer simply captives. They were witnesses to the end of a world, living paradoxically in a space that had preserved human dignity even as their nation disintegrated. The taste of ice cream and the fizz of Coca-Cola, trivial pleasures in peacetime, had become symbols of survival, contrast, and the possibility of moral victory. They marked the boundary between what was lost and what endured, between hatred and human decency. And as May 1945 dawned, the prisoners faced a new reality. Germany had fallen, yet they had survived. Survival now carried with it a responsibility to understand, to remember, and in time to reconcile. May 8, 1945, VE Day. Victory in Europe was declared. Across the continent, the war was over. For the German POWs in the United States, the news traveled slowly through camp radios, newspapers, and word of mouth, yet its impact was immediate and profound. Inside the camps, men reacted in a spectrum of ways. Some wept quietly, clutching letters from home, thinking of family in ruined cities. Others laughed nervously, unable to comprehend survival when so much had been lost. Many simply sat in the mess halls, staring at the walls, tasting the bitter irony of their situation. Germany was gone, yet they were alive, fed, and still free to move within the wire. At Camp Aliceville, Alabama, officers organized a small ceremony. They allowed prisoners to hear the radio broadcast of Churchill's speech celebrating victory. A group of teenagers cheered hesitantly, while older veterans remained silent, grappling with disbelief. One soldier later recalled, "We had survived what we were told would destroy us, yet it felt like living in a dream. Outside, everything was rubble. Here, everything continued." The paradox weighed heavily. These men had fought to the death, for a cause that no longer existed, yet the Americans who had held them captive treated them with kindness. Guards offered extra rations, invited POWs to baseball games, and even shared stories about life back home. Small gestures, a chocolate bar, a plate of ice cream, a cold Coca-Cola, carried unexpected meaning. They were symbols of normalcy, compassion, and, unintentionally, moral superiority. In some camps, the impact of American hospitality was almost tangible. Diaries and post-war memoirs describe men stepping out into the sunlight, savoring ice cream or watching baseball, and realizing that human kindness could exist amid war. One POW wrote, "I never imagined that an enemy could be so good, that they could feed us, play with us, and smile while our country burned. It changed something inside me." For many, this was more than comfort. It was cultural dissonance turned moral awakening. They had been indoctrinated to hate, trained to kill, and taught that America was decadent and weak. Now they experienced the opposite: efficiency, generosity, and civility. This collision of expectation and reality reshaped perceptions in ways no battlefield could. At the same time, the prisoners had to face the human cost of Germany's defeat. Letters from family described destroyed homes, lost jobs, and grief for dead friends. Those who had been conscripted as teenagers, once proud of their uniforms, now realized that their service had contributed to destruction they could barely comprehend. The psychological burden was immense, relief for survival intertwined with shame, grief, and moral reckoning. Some prisoners responded with reflection, others with guilt. At Camp Ruston, Louisiana, a small group of soldiers quietly held informal debates on the war and its meaning. They discussed Hitler's failures, the lies of propaganda, and their own complicity. In these moments, the camp became a microcosm of post-war Germany, a place of reckoning, learning, and moral confrontation. The Americans overseeing these camps watched with quiet fascination. Many soldiers realized that by treating their captives humanely, they had achieved a subtle victory: the dismantling of loyalty to a brutal regime. POWs began cooperating with camp life, participating in educational programs, and even assisting in cultural exchanges. By the time the European War ended, thousands of German prisoners had not only survived physically, but had been exposed to ideas and experiences that would shape their post-war identities. The symbolism of everyday life inside the camps cannot be overstated. Baseball games, music lessons, lectures, and yes, ice cream and Coca-Cola became markers of moral and psychological contrast. For the POWs, these were reminders that civilization could survive despite global destruction, that life could continue with dignity, even when the world around them had been torn apart. In a small but telling example, POWs at Camp Forest, Tennessee, were given the opportunity to participate in the planting of a community garden. They worked alongside American soldiers and civilians, sharing labor and laughter. One veteran later reflected, "We planted seeds for food, and I realized we were planting seeds for understanding. That was the first time I believed a world without hatred was possible." As VE Day gave way to the weeks that followed, the camps became arenas of quiet transformation. The initial fear, disbelief, and resentment had softened into observation, adaptation, and sometimes admiration. Prisoners wrote letters home describing both destruction and kindness, astonishment and gratitude. They carried with them an entirely new perspective, a recognition that the human capacity for decency could exist even in the midst of global conflict. By the summer of 1945, the POWs were no longer simply captives. They were witnesses. Witnesses to the collapse of a nation, to the endurance of a continent, and to the strange paradox of humanity persisting in war. The taste of ice cream, the fizz of a Coca-Cola, the crack of a baseball bat, once trivial pleasures, now carried profound significance. They were symbols of survival, of cultural awakening, and of moral contrast. And as the camps prepared for the next phase, repatriation to a destroyed homeland, the prisoners faced a final, inescapable truth: the world had changed, and so had they. The stage was set for the next chapter, the aftermath, where the consequences of survival, moral reflection, and cultural exposure would become tangible in letters, interviews, and the lives of returning soldiers. With Germany's surrender in May 1945, the war in Europe had officially ended. Across the United States, German POWs began to comprehend what defeat truly meant. For many, survival was a relief. For others, it was a bitter reminder of the destruction left behind: cities in ruins, families displaced, livelihoods destroyed. These realities were gradually reaching prisoners through censored letters and news bulletins. Repatriation became the next logistical challenge. The U.S. War Department faced the monumental task of transporting hundreds of thousands of men back to a homeland that no longer resembled the one they had left. Shipping schedules were drawn, trains were readied, and medical screenings conducted to ensure that only fit men were sent back immediately. Those requiring care or unable to travel were held longer. For the prisoners, the transition stirred conflicting emotions. Many had come to appreciate the humane treatment and relative calm of the American camps. Letters sent home reveal a recurring astonishment. Men who had expected cruelty instead found food, shelter, and respect. One POW at Camp Clinton, Mississippi, wrote, "We were told to expect suffering, yet here we were, eating ice cream, drinking soda, and watched over by men who treated us as if we mattered. How is this possible?" These reflections were not mere nostalgia for comfort. They represented a deeper moral confrontation. Many soldiers began to question the ideology they had served, recognizing the stark contrast between Nazi doctrine and American practice. This dissonance would later influence post-war decisions, including emigration, advocacy for democracy, and efforts to rebuild German society on new ethical foundations. The process of repatriation itself highlighted the enduring human impact of the POW camps. As men boarded ships for Germany, they carried with them not only the physical memories of survival, but the psychological imprint of life behind the American wire. Small acts of generosity, a shared baseball game, an extra ration, a friendly conversation with a guard, had left lasting impressions. For many, these gestures were the first experiences of dignity and equality after years of indoctrination and wartime brutality. Local communities in the United States also recorded the impact of the POWs. Farmers who had relied on POW labor for harvests wrote letters to military authorities expressing gratitude for the work ethic, politeness, and cooperation of the prisoners. Some towns held informal farewell ceremonies, recognizing the human connection that had grown in an unlikely environment of captivity. These events underscored the subtle but enduring influence of humane treatment, even amid the broader context of global conflict. At the same time, repatriation posed challenges. Not all prisoners were prepared to return to a devastated Germany. Some faced hostility from civilians who had endured the war's hardships. Others struggled to reconcile the psychological comfort of camp life with the stark reality of home. For younger men, especially teenagers conscripted late in the war, the transition was particularly jarring. They had survived a total war, witnessed moral contradictions, and tasted a freedom that was entirely absent from their homeland. Despite these challenges, the overarching narrative of the American POW camps remained one of cautious optimism. The United States had demonstrated that even in total war, humane treatment was possible. that enemies could be held without cruelty and engaged without dehumanization. This model of captivity would later inform both military policy and broader discussions of international law and human rights. Memoirs written decades later reinforced this impression. Former prisoners often recalled the small but striking details: the cold ice cream on a hot summer day, the crack of a baseball bat across the camp diamond, or the effervescence of Coca-Cola served in a paper cup. These experiences were more than curiosities. They became symbols of contrast, markers of what a society could be even in the midst of chaos and destruction. In the months following Germany's surrender, many POWs also reflected on their own survival. Unlike civilians who had suffered bombing, starvation, and occupation, they had experienced a controlled, humane environment. This paradox, being enemy soldiers yet treated better than millions back home, left deep impressions. Letters, diaries, and interviews reveal an enduring sentiment: gratitude mixed with guilt, astonishment mingled with disbelief. The first shipments back to Germany began in late summer 1945. Groups of prisoners boarded troop ships. Traveling across the Atlantic under American supervision, officers reminded them of the discipline expected during transit. Yet the atmosphere was markedly different from wartime. Conversations among POWs often centered on the future: who would return to farming, who would study, and who might emigrate. Many spoke quietly about what they had learned, not from textbooks or propaganda, but from lived experience. By the time the last prisoners were repatriated, the scale of the American POW program had become apparent. Tens of thousands of men had spent months, in some cases years, inside these camps. They had survived a war that destroyed their homeland, experienced human kindness from the nation that had fought them, and returned to Germany profoundly changed. This phase of the story marked the bridge between captivity and post-war life. The POWs' experiences would ripple through Germany for decades, influencing education, cultural exchange, and even immigration patterns. Those who had once been trained to hate now carried lessons in morality, empathy, and the quiet power of humane treatment. And as the ships carried them back across the Atlantic, the prisoners knew one thing clearly: the war in Europe was over. But the true aftermath of understanding, reflection, and human reckoning was only beginning. For the German POWs returning to a devastated homeland, the contrast between American camps and post-war Germany could not have been more striking. Cities lay in ruins, infrastructure was destroyed, and millions of civilians faced hunger, displacement, and uncertainty. Men who had spent months or years in humane captivity now confronted a landscape defined by loss, chaos, and the lingering shadow of the regime they had once served. Yet many carried with them something more enduring than memories of ice cream and baseball. The experience of being treated with respect, dignity, and decency had left a subtle but profound imprint on their worldview. Former prisoners often wrote in memoirs and letters that their time in American camps forced them to rethink loyalty, morality, and the nature of leadership. One veteran recalled, "I came home to rubble, but I carried with me the knowledge that humanity could exist even in wartime. It changed how I saw my country, my leaders, and myself." Some of these men became agents of post-war reconstruction, applying lessons learned in captivity to rebuilding Germany. They advocated for democratic institutions, promoted tolerance, and participated in programs designed to educate a new generation. In interviews conducted decades later, several emphasized the quiet influence of everyday experiences, sharing meals, playing sports, and witnessing Americans' adherence to law and order even in wartime. The POW camps also left an unintended diplomatic legacy. Letters and memoirs circulated widely, offering evidence that America could fight a total war while upholding moral standards. These accounts served as a counter-narrative to Nazi propaganda and helped shape post-war German perceptions of the United States. For many Germans, the camps became synonymous not with humiliation, but with an alternative vision of civilization, a society capable of defeating a regime without abandoning humanity. In the United States, the presence of POWs in local communities had subtle social effects as well. Farmers who relied on POW labor often recalled the experience as transformative, noting that the men were polite, cooperative, and surprisingly adaptable. Towns that hosted camps witnessed cultural exchanges that would resonate for decades. children who played with prisoners, local residents who attended baseball games or performances, and Americans who learned that the enemy could be human. Even admirable, for the prisoners themselves, small cultural artifacts became enduring symbols. Ice cream and Coca-Cola, once mundane comforts, evolved into markers of moral and cultural contrast. They reminded former POWs that a society could be powerful yet humane, victorious yet respectful. Baseball diamonds, recreation halls, and educational programs symbolized possibilities that had been unimaginable in wartime Germany. The psychological impact of these experiences was far-reaching. Men who had been indoctrinated to hate learned, sometimes reluctantly, that authority could coexist with empathy. They discovered that obedience did not require cruelty, and that comfort and discipline could coexist. These lessons, internalized during captivity, often guided their post-war choices in family life, work, education, and civic participation. Some former POWs chose to return to Germany and help rebuild their communities, using their insights to promote tolerance and cooperation. Others, inspired by their time in America, emigrated, carrying first-hand knowledge of democratic society, moral governance, and cultural exchange. Across both continents, these men became living examples of how humane treatment during wartime could shape post-war attitudes, bridging divides created by decades of conflict. Academic studies conducted after the war confirm the significance of the American POW experience. Researchers found that the vast majority of German prisoners who spent months in U.S. camps reported a profound change in their perception of Americans, democracy, and even themselves. Exposure to humane treatment, freedom of movement within the camps, and access to education and recreation had measurable effects on attitudes, contributing to the reconstruction of German civil society. The legacy extended beyond individual lives. For policymakers and military planners, the success of the POW system demonstrated the strategic and moral advantages of humane treatment. It reinforced the principles of the Geneva Convention and offered a model for future conflicts. Enemies could be controlled without dehumanization, and in doing so, long-term benefits could be achieved for both captor and captive. By the late 1940s, the full scope of this legacy was evident. Former prisoners, now civilians, recounted stories of American kindness and unexpected pleasures: cold ice cream on hot days, the fizz of Coca-Cola, baseball games in the sun, and polite conversation with soldiers who were once considered enemies. These memories endured as symbols of a war paradoxically fought with both destruction and decency, and for those who had survived, the ultimate lesson of the camps was clear: humanity could prevail even in the darkest chapters of history. The experience of American captivity became a lens through which they viewed the world, a reminder that empathy, moral courage, and simple acts of kindness could withstand even the totality of war. As these men returned home, the stage was set for reflection, remembrance, and reconciliation. They had survived not only the collapse of their nation, but also the moral and cultural upheaval of captivity. And in the quiet details, a baseball bat, a scoop of ice cream, a cold Coca-Cola, they carried the seeds of understanding that would endure long after the guns fell silent. The war in Europe ended in destruction, rubble, and grief. Cities lay in ruins, families mourned, and the ideology that had swept millions into violence was extinguished. Yet thousands of German soldiers had returned home carrying a different memory, a quiet testament to the paradox of war. Behind the fences of American POW camps, men who had once been trained to hate had been confronted with humanity. They had seen order without cruelty, discipline without oppression, and kindness offered to enemies. They had tasted ice cream, sipped Coca-Cola, and played baseball in a world that continued to function with calm and generosity, even as their homeland burned. These small, seemingly trivial experiences became profound markers of moral and cultural contrast. They were more than food, games, or music. They were symbols of a society that could wield power without abandoning decency, that could defeat an enemy while preserving human dignity. For many prisoners, these moments became a lens through which to reassess the world they had once served, a world built on lies, fear, and destruction. The legacy of these camps extended far beyond the men who lived inside them. Communities in rural America, farmers and townspeople who interacted with POWs, witnessed firsthand the humanity of individuals labeled as enemies. Relationships formed over shared labor, games and conversation blurred lines that war had attempted to harden. These interactions planted seeds of reconciliation that would flourish in the post-war years, shaping perceptions on both sides of the Atlantic. For the prisoners themselves, the experience was transformative. Exposure to American life forced reflection on morality, leadership, and civic responsibility. It offered a counterexample to the totalitarian world they had known, a demonstration that societies could function with order, fairness, and generosity. Many carried these lessons into post-war Germany, influencing education, civic engagement, and the rebuilding of social structures. Some even chose to emigrate, bringing first-hand knowledge of a humane, democratic society to new homes. The story of these camps challenges the conventional narrative of war. It reminds us that victory need not be measured only in destroyed cities, defeated armies, or political dominance. Victory can also be found in the preservation of humanity, in the quiet power of empathy, and in the small acts that endure long after the guns fall silent. Ice cream on a summer day, a baseball game in the sun, a friendly conversation with a former enemy. These were victories of a different kind, subtle yet profound. Looking back, the experience of German POWs in American camps offers a lesson that resonates beyond history. It shows that even amid total conflict, the human spirit can persist, and that moral courage can leave a lasting imprint. The war ended with devastation in Europe, yet within fenced camps in Texas, Alabama, and Mississippi, another story was being written, one of dignity, curiosity, and cultural awakening. It is a story of contradiction and hope, of men who were captives but experienced freedom, of enemies who were treated as humans, of a society that demonstrated power without cruelty, and of a world that, even in its darkest hours, offered glimpses of decency and possibility. For the German soldiers who survived, the lessons endured. They returned to a broken homeland, but they carried memories of a different reality, one that would shape their understanding of morality, society, and humanity itself. And in the quiet moments, when they remembered the taste of ice cream, the fizz of a Coca-Cola, or the crack of a baseball bat across a sunlit field, they recalled a truth that the war could never erase, that even in total destruction, human kindness could prevail. The story of these camps is not merely a footnote of history. It is a reflection on the enduring power of compassion, the subtle triumph of decency, and the unexpected ways in which humanity can survive even the most devastating of conflicts. It is here, in these small yet profound moments, that the war's greatest paradox is revealed, that even in captivity, even in defeat, men could encounter the strength of human kindness and witness a world that endured beyond the destruction of their own. And in that paradox lies the quiet, lasting truth of history, that the measure of civilization is not only what it destroys, but what it preserves in its enemies, in its values, and in the simple, enduring acts of human decency.